Hello, I'm Janet Ellis, and on behalf of Tull Stories, welcome to this Q&A for Motherboard with director Victoria Mapplebeck, executive producer Debbie Manners, and the subject of Motherboard, Jim Mapplebeck. This is a unique and precious journey through one family's life shot over 20 years, and the family in question is mother and son. I have to say, having watched it several times now, it still makes me cry. What effect did you think it would have, Victoria?
I'm sad to hear it makes people cry, but I think when you're covering 20 years of motherhood with some difficult moments, with some disappointments, with some anxiety in there when I got breast cancer, I think it would be weird if it didn't. There were some tearful moments, but it was also my intention to make sure there is plenty of kind of gallows humor, which sort of counters that, because I think I wouldn't want to do a sort of trauma dump, even though we have been through some difficult things over 20 years, which really what family hasn't. So comedy was important. But yeah, I did want it to be sort of intimate and a 3D portrait of motherhood. So I think it is emotional. And I didn't want to disguise when I went through the breast cancer time. I feel like sometimes we do have a bit of a filtered cultural look at what cancer looks like. And I wanted to really show it for how it is, physically and emotionally, and particularly the effect that it had on Jim. So, yeah, I think it inevitably, I've not met many people who didn't come out having reached for a tissue at some point.
It did make me laugh as well, I have to say, and a lot of other
Good.
emotions too. And I think the sadness in it is to do with lots of things, not just what's happening
Mm,
to you, but of course we've all been there in some shape or form, either as
mm,
teenagers or parents. So
mm.
there is a huge kind of identity crisis going on right the way through it. Jim, what did you think? What effect did you think it would have on people?
I think what I really like about it and why I actually think the crime thing isn't necessarily a massive negative is that I think stories that are so connected to us as humans, the anatomy of humans and the kind of psychology of humans will always make us kind of more emotional in senses. And I think why it can be quite an emotional film to watch is it is about as real as it gets in terms of kind of own lives, you know what I mean? So it's a very raw and real project and you're looking at real people and their own real lives. There's bits where it's definitely more humorous and then there's bits where it's kind of sad. And I think it kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat. It kind of makes you think what's going to happen next, how will this look, how will this affect their lives. I think it's a film that doesn't definitively have one emotion or one set reaction. It's always up for interpretation.
Victoria, you were, a single parent and you had to adjust your working practice. And I sensed a huge amount of, let's call it disappointment at the unsupportive nature of our industry. How did you feel at the time? Did you feel a bit let down?
I did really, because I was a freelance TV director in the 90s and the 2000s. And when I found myself at 38, single, pregnant, and broke, I kind of realized that that just was not going to work as a career. And that's because at the time, it was not an industry that was particularly supportive of women, particularly single women, particularly women raising a kid completely on their own. And I knew that I didn't want to give Jim two absent parents. When I realized his dad wasn't going to be involved, and I just thought I couldn't do the long hours and the working away. And so I had to switch to teaching, although I always loved teaching, but it was much more child friendly. And then I think we also caught the sort of sexism of the industry again later on when Debbie and I spent a long time. I mean, really, we've been working on. I mean, Motherboard is 20 years of footage, but we've been in full-time production really for about 8 years. And we have just had rejection after rejection and been ghosted from all of the normal, the sort of some of the usual suspects about documentary funding. And I think I tell a story, which is even after Debbie and I won an award, we got a meeting with a big shot producer who told us that Motherboard was too small for him and too personal, and he wanted big, epic stories about true crime and space. And I just thought, sod it, we've got nothing to lose here. So I said, well, do you know what? Raising a kid entirely on my own, him meeting his dad for the first time as a teenager, closely followed by my breast cancer, has put us on a pretty epic journey. So I think that needs to change. You know, I know Michaela Cole had that early on in her career. Her work was described as small. And of course, the stuff that goes on behind doors in your personal life, in your relationships, in your family, in your parenting is huge. It is epic. It does put you on an entirely epic journey. And I think male commissioners in particular need to recognize the appeal. You know, when we do get bums on seats in Motherboard, there is a tremendous sort of relatability to the film. You know, I thought Jim described brilliantly how it captures the humanness, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly of family life, and it's hugely relatable, and we always get a really good response. So frustrating that it's been such a long thing, but we did get money from Oka in the end, who are linked to Wellcome Trust, who were amazing, and thank God.
When did you know that this was going to be a shared story?
I didn't give birth to Jim and then think on that day one, oh, I'm going to document this kid's life for the next 20 years. And because I had my old DV cam kit from when I was a freelance director, that was the sort of home movie apparatus. So I filmed Jim up until about 6 or 7 on that old DV camera. And then I did miss filmmaking. As much as I love teaching, I really missed a kind of creative life. And actually, I began by writing. That was because, of course, you can write for nothing, which I think is probably why there's so many women writers in publishing. And so I began by writing a short story when Jim was maybe about 10, using the Nokia text messages that you see in Motherboard as a starting point and kind of writing the story behind each message. And then that became a 40,000 word memoir. Curtis Brown took it on but couldn't get it published. And then what saved the day was I got my first short film commission from Film London in 2015, to make a film about those Nokia texts, which in a way was the beginning of telling this whole story. I was able to do that because I switched to shooting on smartphones. And that seemed perfect because, of course, so many of the memories you see in Motherboard are archived in our phones, you know, voicemails, voice notes, ridiculous amounts of photographs of Jim and videos of us both. And so it was lovely to bring that archive to life with a mobile phone. And budget wise, that was really liberating because it meant we could keep going without funding and keep documenting those key storylines. For access, it was incredible. Like, I can't really go back because when I was going through the cancer treatment, and it really helped me to film my own kind of horrible word cancer journey, but the treatment and that year of treatment. I didn't ever contact the comms department of King's College Hospital or wherever I was. I would just rock up with my mobile and say, would you mind if I filmed in selfie mode? I won't film other patients. And it was never a no. And of course, it would have been had I had a whole crew in tow, or even a bigger, more professional kit, you know. And so, really, 80% of Motherboard is shot on smartphones from the iPhone 5 right the way through to the iPhone 15.
You might have thought that carrying a big old camera gave you permission to distance yourself from what
Mm.
you're filming, but in fact, you didn't want to. You wanted to keep it intimate. So, whether or
Mm.
not it was intentional at the time, it's turned out to be absolutely at the core of the film.
There's also a distancing factor, which is that you have some sense of agency if you're telling a story, even if you're telling it with just a very intimate, small bit of tech, which is the phone in your pocket. And that did really help me because I think one of the most difficult things of going through cancer is just how disempowering it is. And nobody wants to feel like a victim or so out of control, but you are really, and you have to lean into it. But the telling my story of it, and when I used to have a really terrible on the shittiest days, if I'd got a good bit of footage, I would feel better about it because I'd feel it would capture something that might be relatable to other people or even helpful to other people. So it was incredibly therapeutic for me to be able to film the whole cancer and the anxieties it brought into the family, because I think it was one of the most difficult points in mine and Jim's life, really, because having a parent with a cancer diagnosis is difficult for any young person. Jim was 13 when I was diagnosed, but particularly when you are the lone parent, it's doubly hard, you know.
Were you aware when you are literally as a young person, 13-year-old, watching your mum's cancer journey, were you aware at the time of how difficult it was?
When you're going through a kind of many sense of trauma, nothing really kind of feels right. Your brain's so muddled, and you feel like everything's kind of spiraling around. And I did feel quite confused at the time with everything. I think my response methods are quite interesting to look at now. And of course, now I wouldn't do any of them. But I think at the time, it was my way of coping. It was my way of kind of getting through the, the poo show that was cancer. It's actually quite nice to have those clips to look back at and just to see that we got through it.
Mm.
There were many times that I didn't think it was going to have a very happy ending. So, I'm very eternally grateful to kind of be where we are now,
Mm.
and to be able to speak about it and laugh about it and whatever.
There are several points watching Motherboard where I'm either the parent or the child. I mean, it's an
Mm.
extraordinary thing, and I love the way you said that bad news is like getting extra homework. You know, it actually, although that's, for want of a better word, a childish illusion, it's so true. It's just
Mm.
like it comes from nowhere and it's not what you wanted and it puts everything wrong and you can't
Mm.
go forward in the way that you did.
The reason why it's different from homework is with homework, there's always a due date. There's always a deadline that you've got to hit. Even with my work now, I've got an essay to hit on Friday, which I've not really started. So, we've got real world deadlines with many aspects of life. Work, anything. There are so many deadlines we've got to hit. But I think with bad news, it's always quite daunting because there is never a deadline on it. You don't know how long you're going to feel a certain way or react to something in a certain manner. I think me and mum moved a lot with the film. You know what I mean? Like you see this journey and we move 100% with it. The parallel journeys that it had of the film's evolution, but also our own evolution as, growing up, I guess, um, is really interesting because they definitely did collide in a really positive way, I thought.
We had the luxury of time, and that was really useful. So when we had that phone row, which had captured that, what pretty much everyone's probably been through who've got teenage kids, that sort of awful meltdown row that you have in lockdown. And remember playing it to Jim about a month. I'd been recording all my landline calls for a separate sound project I was doing because we went back to landline calls in lockdown. And it played it to Jim, and I think he knew it was strong, but because he gets really heated and he's saying, shut up, that he was worried about how he would be perceived. But we had 3 years rather to really think about whether that call would be in Motherboard or not. And a whole duty of care period that we were doing with our funder that was really useful. And as part of that, we had a test screening with that scene. And I think Jim was a real turnaround because he kind of felt, well, Jim, I'm not going to talk through you, but you might say a bit about that.
I think it was, useful having that screening, because I think, in life we have a very kind of complex perception of ourselves, and it can be very hard to think about other people's views as well in terms of what they may think rather than what we think. And I think it's nice for the film because, of course, we have that power, and it was nice to see other people's reactions to it and kind of not realize that I wasn't the worst person in the world. It's nice to kind of view it in that sense because you kind of realize how long that process took, but also like there's a lot of cogs that went along with it. And it wasn't just a thing of when mum's going, I think this works, like, we don't really care what you think, Jim. Like it's a point where it's like I had to massively look at it and think, will this work? Look at how I am now and look at me then. And yeah, I mean, of course, it's a bit that I don't look proudly upon. I don't think I acted in a way that I ever really should. However, it was such an accurate description of what went on at the time, and I do find it quite funny to look back on.
Well, actually, it's interesting watching it. Obviously, this is 20 precious years compressed into an hour and a half, but it still tells such a full story. And the shift in agency is remarkable. So that obviously, when you're having those rows, you are adolescent. By the time you're talking about your mum's New Year's resolutions, you're a contemporary. You've
Mm.
shifted through it. And I think, Victoria, you did an amazing thing actually, because it must have been pretty tempting to wrap Jim in cotton wool, to protect him from the world. And you have given him such freedom, which is inspiring, absolutely inspiring.
Thank you. I mean, I think it was also that the mission for the film was to really create that kind of 3D portrait of motherhood. So it couldn't just all be the sweet, lovely, sentimental stuff. It had to be the tough stuff that we're talking about, because otherwise it wouldn't have felt like a very kind of authentic. But yes, and also the gym being a huge part of that process and having power of veto and watching assemblies and watching cuts. It's why Jim has a creative consultant
Mm.
credit, because he was a big part of what storylines do we want in, and everything was not in. There were definitely no limits areas that we decided that were not going to be in the final film. Yeah, it wouldn't be the film it needed to be without that, I don't think.
I just wanted to add on as well. I think what I really like about the film is, of course, the story itself. I do feel like there's a lot of other people that make up the film, and of course, to name Debbie as one mainly. I
Mm.
think a very, very big part of the film in a positive way, but also all the editing team, Oka, of course, were a massive part of it. We had quite a hard decision in terms of who we let in, but it's a project that, when we were looking at who to bring in, it was a project that needed to be done with a lot of care. I'm incredibly grateful that there was such a good team behind it, specifically coming from Debbie as well, because it's not an easy feat.
Debbie, how did you approach the duty of care? Because obviously, by default, Jim was a very young person who couldn't fully give consent for quite a lot of this. At what point did you have to take on that role?
Um, well, we talked about it quite a lot in the early days when with the short films, and in fact, one of the short films was in fact on a channel. So we kind of went through a fairly formal process. But at that point, Jim was young enough, and there was relatively little complexity around his role because he was very sweet. He was kind of it was really the journey was about him wanting to meet his dad. It was quite a simple story at that point. So it was really the point at which we started to get through, actually come out the other side of some of the more difficult times, and the cancer, um, and actually at a point when he was actually getting to be 18, so the big question in some ways was, okay, yes, he's 18, so technically he can sign a release form now, and everybody could just say, oh, it's fine. But of course it's much more complicated than that, because at 18 you're still incredibly young at 18. This film's going to be around potentially forever. It's about how might this affect him in 10 years time or 20 years time. So there was big conversations. Oka were fantastic in that they said, look, before we absolutely kick off with our main sort of tranche of funding, we want you to go back and do a sort of almost like a development period again and think about specifically about duty of care. And so we did have to face up to those conversations, and we brought in a few other experts, psychologists, other filmmakers who'd had various different experiences around people's contributions and difficult contributions to documentary. So that was fantastic. And then the other key thing we had to think about. So we had to think about, what impact might this have on Jim? Does he really understand what he's signing up for? And is he okay with that? What impact is it going to have on Victoria? Is she okay with that? And then also, what impact is it going to have not so much on Jim's dad, because he's not nobody knows who he is, he's anonymized in the film, but more, how do we make sure that if Jim wants to have a relationship with him later in life, even if he's chosen at the moment not to, that we don't close that door. I suppose the big focus of the impact was on Jim. You've also got to think about what would be the impact of Jim if the film didn't get made, because actually there've been all these positives around the film being made. So it wasn't as simple as, oh, it's, perhaps it should just never be put out there because it's, all of these negative impacts are around the film existing. It was actually, she said, well, think about what would happen if it didn't happen. This is a really important piece of work of art for Victoria. It's really important for his mother and his relationship with his mother. It's important, actually, as it happens, of course, Jim has gone into a career where he's very comfortable with being on screen. So that's helpful. I think it would have been really different if he hadn't wanted to do that, actually. But it meant that, we really did properly think about the issues in the round, and it was a very important process to go through. And I think the outcome is very much as partly as a result of having asked the difficult questions. I think the reason everyone has felt okay about it, actually, Jim, particularly you, has been that we did actually ask those questions. I think if we'd done it without asking those questions, you would have perhaps, always thought, oh, did I think about that? Or, whatever. Whereas I think hopefully we got you to think about the tough stuff at the right point.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I
Mm.
think I was able to think about stuff that maybe I necessarily wasn't thinking about at the time, especially for the
Mm.
future. I think it was really important. So yeah, no, I think it was a really good process because I kind of came out feeling respected and heard, which I think is what you want, you know.
There are many, many strands to this film. I hope everybody watches it because we don't have time to touch on them all now. But Debbie, we've already mentioned this. It's extremely difficult to get funding for
Mm.
anything. But
Mm.
for a project like this, what tactics did you use?
Well, we tried everything really, and I think the key tactic that we used was perseverance. I think we just didn't give up.
Didn't
Um,
stop.
the big chunk of funding came from Oka, which was brilliant, and they just believed in it in its kind of absolute sort of raw fundamental form, actually, and they let us do the work, the creative work, which was a very, very empowering thing to do. We didn't do it to make money. We did it because we thought it was a good film. We wanted to make the film. We thought it was an important film. We disagree that it's a small story. We don't think that, and we have lots of issues around that kind of way women's stories are often belittled. We know how hard it is to get films in the cinema, and I think even big films in the cinema don't do well these days. So I think it's a massive, massive achievement of which we're really proud.
Rightly so, rightly so. Such an extraordinarily good lesson. And I think we do tend to end up protecting our children from reality. And look how well it turns out when you don't.
There's a point, isn't there, in your life with teenagers where you suddenly realize that it's not going to be perfect all the time because that's what you want. You want them to be really happy and you want them to feel safe and secure and you want everything to be perfect. And it's just not reality. It's not just part of allowing Jim to be free and make his own decisions. It's also part of Victoria's decision to allow people to unknow that those things happen and be okay about it. Because that's so brilliant for everyone that watches it. That's why people love the film. If it was all sweetness and light all the way through, it wouldn't be half the film it is. And it wouldn't be enjoyable and it wouldn't be relatable.
Well, it's the complexity of love, isn't it? Love is
Mm,
not straightforward either. I think
exactly.
I think it should be required viewing in schools, actually.
Yeah.
I think it should be because there's a lot of discussion post-adolescence about the kind of way that young men are not processing feelings
Mm,
and the
mm,
whole incel movement. And I think Jim is the sort of poster boy man for emotional intelligence. He's always had an amazing emotional intelligence. And I think that is something to do
mm,
with lone women
mm,
parents because there's so much hand wringing about, boys these days being over mothered and under fathered. But I see that because I see it in Debbie's kids as well. She's a single parent to three kids, two men. And they've got a similar, particularly your youngest, Debbie,
mm,
Alex, has got a similar emotional intelligence. And I think it's that, of course, there are pros and it doesn't matter in whether the gender of your parents or the amount of whether it's two parents or one parent. But I think what I've got in common with Debbie is there was just tremendous love in our families and also a real passion about we don't like being made to feel that because we were single parents that there was something terribly lacking and that
mm.
our kids are forever deprived because there wasn't a male, the amount of times both me and Debbie have
Mm.
been asked, well, are there male role models
Yeah.
in your kid's life? Like you can't do some of the things that might be traditionally done by men or by fathers. So I hope it's a sort of celebration of families in all shapes and sizes, and particularly families that are curated by women. So yeah, I hope it is relatable for all Homo sapiens.